My name is Caroline, and I am 33 years old. 5 years ago, I stood at the back of the Houston Petroleum Club, clutching a glass of lukewarm water, while my father Julian raised a toast to my sister Savannah. In front of 200 guests, he called her the rising star of Texas real estate and the only true legacy of our family name. Then he pointed at me and told a table of billionaire investors that I was the mentally unstable family project who finally found a job. He used that lie to explain why I was the only person excluded from the official anniversary photo. Julian laughed, and the whole room laughed with him while I stood there in a dress I bought on sale, feeling my entire world tilt on its axis. I walked out that night, blocked every single number, and disappeared from their lives for 1,825 days. I was done being the invisible daughter. I was done being the punchline to a joke I never told. Then last week, a man in a sharp suit knocked on my door in Austin and handed me a manila envelope from the Sterling law firm. My father finally needed something from the daughter he had erased. Before we get into what was inside that envelope, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments, because I love knowing where you are right now. Now let me take you back to the fall of 2019, to a graduation ceremony my parents never attended, and the text message that told me I was no longer part of the real family. Austin is only a 3-hour drive from Houston, but for the last 5 years, it felt like a different planet. I worked as a trauma nurse coordinator, a job where I managed literal life and death chaos with a level of clinical precision that my parents used to call erratic. My husband Mark is a public defender who Julian labeled a downgrade because he chose justice over an oil-funded lifestyle. We built a quiet life of sensible furniture and mutual respect, the kind of home where nobody is managed and nobody is a prop. I thought I was safe. I thought the silence meant I had finally won my freedom. But then Mr. Whitaker, the attorney, sat on my sofa looking like a man who had never seen a house without marble floors. He produced a document regarding the Julian and Claire family trust. After 5 years of silence, they didn't want to apologize. They didn't want to see their daughter. They wanted my signature to dissolve a specific land-holding entity in West Texas. As I read through the legal jargon, I realized my father hadn't missed me at all. He had just run out of other people to exploit. Savannah had driven her real estate brokerage into the ground, and they were looking for a way to liquidate the last of my grandmother's legacy to pay for her mistakes. As I scanned the exhibit attached to the back of the trust documents, my heart stopped. There was a signature on a waiver of interest dated 2 years ago that bore my name. It was a near-perfect replica, but the spacing was all wrong. The C in Caroline was too tight, a tiny physical tell that my sister Savannah has struggled with since we were kids. They didn't just disown me 5 years ago. They had spent the last 2 years using my name and my supposed mental instability as a legal shield to forge my consent on a $450,000 asset transfer. Mr. Whitaker looked at me and asked if I was feeling okay or if I needed a moment to process the information. I didn't cry and I didn't scream. I began to laugh. It was a sharp, clear, resonant sound that startled the lawyer so much he dropped his pen. I was laughing because I realized that every single time they told people I was in a long-term care facility, they weren't trying to hide their shame. They were protecting their crime. They had created a version of me that was a tragedy just so they could steal the only thing my grandmother Pearl had left specifically for me. Julian always said that image was everything, and now I realized exactly how much that image had cost me. My name is Caroline, and for the last 5 years, I have existed in the vibrant humidity of Austin while my parents remained encased in the sterile marble of their Houston estate. When I left that anniversary gala, I didn't just walk out of a building, I walked out of a narrative that was designed to suffocate me. I am now 33 years old, and I serve as a trauma nurse coordinator at one of the busiest Level 1 centers in Central Texas. Every single day, I am responsible for managing high-velocity chaos with a level of clinical precision that my parents used to mock as being erratic or overly sensitive. In the emergency bay, There is no room for the kind of managed perfection my mother Claire insists upon. There is only the truth of the heart monitor and the steady pressure of a bandage. While my father Julian was busy telling his golf partners that I was too fragile for the real world, I was busy stabilizing patients who had seen the worst the world had to offer. I moved to Austin because it was exactly 160 miles away from the Sterling family influence, which was just far enough to breathe but close enough to feel the phantom weight of their expectations. My husband Mark is a public defender who works in the belly of the county courthouse. When Julian first met him, he didn't ask about Mark's law degree or his passion for civil rights. He looked at the modest watch on Mark's wrist and the slightly frayed hem of his off-the-rack suit and labeled him a significant downgrade. My parents are people who measure a man's worth by the octane of his car and the zip code of his office. They couldn't understand why I would choose a man who fought for the indigent over a man who traded in favor and oil futures. Mark is the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see a project or a disappointment. He saw a woman of immense steel and quiet capability. He is my rock, and the person who taught me that love is not a transaction where you trade your identity for a seat at a mahogany table. Despite the peace I found in my new life, the silence of the last 5 years was heavy with a specific kind of quiet suffering. It is the hollow realization that your absence didn't actually cause a rift in the family fabric, but instead allowed them to pull the stitches tighter. I realized very early on that I was never the glue holding the Sterling family together. I was the friction they wanted to eliminate. 2 years into my silence, I found out through an accidental login on an old tablet that they had started a secret group chat titled Real Family. There were over 2,000 messages, and not a single one expressed concern for where I was or how I was doing. Instead, they coordinated their stories. They planned holidays without the inconvenience of my medical shifts and mocked the fact that I was likely struggling in a tiny apartment while they toasted to Savannah's latest real estate commission. That realization hit me harder than the gala itself. I remembered the day of my nursing school graduation so clearly. I had worked 3 jobs to pay for that degree because Julian refused to fund a career he considered blue-collar. I sat in the front row scanning the crowd for my father's expensive blazer or my mother's signature pearls. They never arrived. Instead, my phone buzzed with a 6-word text message from Julian that read, "We are busy with Savannah's closing." That was the moment I understood that the golden child's convenience would always outweigh my milestones. Savannah was the rising star because she was willing to perform the role Julian scripted for her, while I was the problem because I insisted on having a soul. For 5 years, I let that silence be my armor. I built a career and a marriage and a sense of self that was entirely independent of the Sterling name. But the arrival of the lawyer Mr. Whitaker on my doorstep proved that you can never truly bury a past built on oil and ego. He sat in my living room looking like a charcoal sketch against the colorful backdrop of my Austin home. He produced a document regarding the Julian and Claire family trust, and I could see the tension in his jaw as he spoke. He wasn't there to offer an olive branch or a late apology. He was there because a legal technicality required my presence. Specifically, he needed me to sign away my rights to a landholding entity in West Texas that was suddenly worth a staggering amount of money. As I reached for the manila envelope, I felt the old familiar knot of anxiety in my chest. But as I flipped to the back pages, my eyes caught on something that made the anxiety vanish, and a cold, sharp rage take its place. There, attached as an exhibit to the trust dissolution, was a waiver of interest dated 2 years ago. It bore my signature in a flowing script that looked almost exactly like my own. But as a nurse, I have spent a decade signing my name on thousands of charts, and I know the muscle memory of my own hand. The C in Caroline was too tight and the loop was too perfect. This wasn't my signature, it was a forgery. And it was a forgery that had allowed my parents to move nearly $500,000 of my grandmother's equity into Savannah's failing brokerage while I was supposedly too unstable to handle my own mail. My laughter started low in my throat before it erupted into the room. It wasn't the laughter of a woman who had lost her mind. It was the laughter of a woman who had just found the receipts. Mr. Whitaker asked if I was all right, and I looked him dead in the eye, and asked if my father Julian had told him I was in a psychiatric facility. The lawyer flinched and adjusted his glasses and admitted that the family had described my situation as long-term medical care. They hadn't just disowned me. They had used my supposed illness as a legal justification to steal from me. They had created a tragedy out of my life just so they could keep the golden child's lifestyle from collapsing. The conflict was no longer about hurt feelings or missed graduations. It was a criminal conspiracy. And now they needed one more signature to clear the title on a $2 million oil lease. I looked at the pen on the table, and then I looked at the lawyer. I wasn't going to sign a thing. I was going to perform a forensic audit of my parents' souls. The layers of the Sterling family were finally peeling back, and the rot underneath was deeper than I ever imagined. Savannah's Dallas real estate career wasn't built on talent. It was built on the stolen remnants of my grandmother Pearl's estate. Pearl was the only person who ever truly saw me, and she had tried to protect me from beyond the grave with a secret codicil. My parents thought they had buried it along with my reputation, but the energy companies in West Texas have much better investigators than my father Julian. They had flagged the forged waiver, and now the entire house of cards was leaning on my Austin doorstep. I realized then that my parents didn't want a reconciliation. They wanted a cleanup crew. They wanted me to be the reliable daughter one last time so they could finish the job of erasing me. I stood up and handed the documents back to Mr. Whitaker without a signature. I told him that I would be in touch after I spoke with my own advisor. The lawyer tried to protest, saying that Julian was in a precarious financial position and that time was of the essence. I just smiled the same way I do when I have to tell a difficult patient that the rules have changed. I told him that my father had 5 years to worry about time, and now it was my turn to set the clock. As the door closed behind him, I felt a new conflict rising. It wasn't just about the land or the money. It was about the fact that they were still trying to manage me, as if I were a child who didn't understand the value of her own name. I picked up my phone and made a call to the one person who could help me trace the path of every dollar they had ever stolen. The hunt was on, and the Sterling family had no idea that the daughter they called unstable was about to become their greatest liability. The lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, sat on the very edge of my mid-century modern sofa, looking as if he were terrified that his dry-cleaned suit might catch a stray pet hair or a speck of Austin dust. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and expensive starch, a living embodiment of the polished Houston world I had fled 5 years ago. He kept his leather briefcase on his lap, like a shield, refusing to let it touch the hand-woven rug Mark and I had picked out during a weekend trip to Santa Fe. I stood in the kitchen doorway drying a coffee mug with a dish towel, feeling the absurdity of the moment. For 5 years, my phone had been a desert of silence from anyone sharing my last name. No birthday texts, no checking in during hurricane season. Nothing. But now here was a representative of the Sterling law firm sitting in my living room because a legal technicality required my presence. I walked over and sat in the armchair opposite him. I didn't offer him coffee or small talk. I knew the rules of the game Julian played. If you give an inch, they take a mile, and if you offer a smile, they assume you are ready to be managed again. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat and produced a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He handled the paper with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics. He explained that he was here regarding the Julian and Claire family trust. My parents had spent 40 years building that trust into a fortress designed to protect their legacy and ensure that Savannah would never have to work a day in her life if she didn't feel like it. But apparently the fortress had a crack and I was the only one who could plug it. As I took the documents, I felt the weight of them in my hands. It was a formal request to dissolve a specific land-holding entity based in West Texas. For the uninitiated, legal jargon is designed to confuse and intimidate. But as a nurse, I have spent my career translating complex medical terminology into plain English for terrified families. I read the pages with a clinical eye. I didn't look for a handwritten note from my mother tucked into the margins. I didn't look for an apology from Julian for the things he said at the gala. I knew better. Instead, I looked at the numbers and the dates. I looked at the corporate structure and the liquidation clauses. The DNA of this entire visit was revealed in the third paragraph of the second page. This wasn't a reach for reconciliation. This was a calculated strategic move to liquidate an asset that had been sitting dormant for decades. My parents didn't miss me. They hadn't suddenly realized that their younger daughter was a person of value. They had simply run out of other people to exploit. Savannah's real estate brokerage in Dallas, which Julian had touted as a monumental success, was actually hemorrhaging cash. Her office space was in arrears, and her high-end listings were sitting on the market like lead weights. To keep the golden child's dream from imploding, my parents needed to sell a 500-acre tract of scrubland in the Permian Basin that was suddenly worth a fortune due to new mineral rights. I looked up from the paper and caught Mr. Whitaker watching me with an expression that was almost pitying. He told me that my parents were very anxious to get this resolved and that they were hoping I would be cooperative for the sake of the family's future. Family is a word Julian uses like a blunt instrument. He uses it to demand loyalty he never earned and sacrifices he never reciprocated. I thought about the graduation they skipped and the secret group chat where they laughed about my struggles. I thought about the way they used my name as a punchline to impress people who didn't even like them. And now they wanted me to be the reliable one. They wanted me to sign a paper so they could continue the charade of Savannah's success. The conflict in the room was a living thing. Mr. Whitaker began to explain that the title company required a unanimous signature from all named beneficiaries to clear the deed for sale. Because I was still legally a part of the trust despite being socially dead to them, my signature was the final hurdle. He mentioned that the buyer was a major energy conglomerate and that the offer would expire at the end of the week. He was pushing for a quick resolution. He even had a gold fountain pen ready. It was the same brand Julian used to sign my childhood report cards with a flourish of disappointment. I set the document down on the coffee table. I told him that I needed time to review the details with my own legal counsel. Mr. Whitaker's composure slipped just a fraction. He adjusted his glasses and reminded me that Julian and Claire were my parents and that they only wanted what was best for everyone. I almost laughed out loud at the word everyone. In the Sterling Dictionary, everyone means Julian, Claire, and Savannah. I was just the ghost in the machine. I asked him if my father had mentioned why I hadn't heard from them in 5 years. The lawyer looked at his shoes and murmured something about a misunderstanding. I stood up and walked to the front door. I told him that I would be in touch. As he gathered his things, I could see the frustration in the set of his shoulders. He was used to dealing with people who were either impressed by the Sterling name or terrified by it. He wasn't used to a woman who had spent 5 years learning exactly what she was worth without a single cent of Julian's money. He walked out into the Texas sun, and I watched his black car pull away from the curb. The silence of my house returned, but it was different now. It was the silence before a storm. I sat back down and picked up the envelope again. My mind was racing. If they were this desperate for my signature, it meant their financial situation was far more precarious than they were letting on. It meant the gala was a lie, and the Dallas brokerage was a lie. My parents were standing on the edge of a cliff, and they were trying to use me as the handrail. But as I flipped through the pages one more time, I saw a signature on a document from 2 years ago that shouldn't have been there. It was my name written in a hand that wasn't mine. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just been waiting for me to come around. They had been actively forging my life while I was gone. The conflict was no longer about a signature. It was about a crime. And the next move wasn't going to be made in a living room. It was going to be made in a courtroom. I realized that my parents hadn't just run out of people to exploit. They had finally tried to exploit the one person who knew exactly how to audit their lies. I held the manila envelope in my hands, feeling the heavy weight of the expensive paper and the even heavier weight of the lies contained within. Mr. Whitaker watched me from the sofa, his eyes darting toward the gold pen he had placed on my coffee table like a baited hook. I ignored him and flipped past the primary dissolution request toward the stack of exhibits attached at the back. As a trauma nurse, I am trained to look for anomalies, for the small details that tell you a patient is crashing before the alarms even sound. My eyes skipped over the legal headers until they landed on a document from 2 years ago. It was a formal waiver of interest in a family subtrust. And there, centered on the signature line, was my name, Caroline Sterling. My breath hitched in my throat, and the air in the living room suddenly felt thin and metallic. I stared at the ink. To an untrained eye, it was a perfect replica of my signature. It had the same sweeping flourish on the end of the lowercase letters, and the same slight tilt to the left. But I have spent the last decade signing my name on thousands of medical charts, and I know the muscle memory of my own hand better than I know the layout of my own kitchen. The spacing of the capital C in Caroline was too tight. It was jammed against the next letter with an anxious energy that I never possessed. I knew that handwriting. It was the exact mistake Savannah used to make when she tried to forge our mother's permission slips in middle school. My sister is a lifelong mimic, a woman who has spent her entire existence trying to occupy spaces that do not belong to her. A cold, visceral realization settled into my stomach like a block of ice. They didn't just disown me 5 years ago. They didn't just walk away and let me find my own path. They had spent the last several years using my absence as a strategic business asset. By telling the world I was mentally unstable and receiving long-term psychiatric care, they had created a perfect legal vacuum. They had convinced the trust officers and the local bankers that I was incapacitated and therefore unable to manage my own affairs. This document in front of me was the physical proof of their crime. Using my forged consent, they had transferred $450,000 of equity from a fund my grandmother intended for my education into a failing real estate brokerage in Dallas. My parents had used my reputation as a shield to steal my future while I was busy saving the lives of strangers in an Austin emergency room. Mr. Whitaker shifted on the sofa, his leather briefcase creaking in the silence. He asked me if I was okay, or if the legal terminology was becoming too overwhelming. He offered a patronizing smile, the kind of look Julian gives to people he thinks are beneath him. I didn't look up at him. I kept my eyes on that cramped little C. I thought about the 3 jobs I worked during nursing school to pay for my own books, while Savannah was using my stolen equity to buy a designer wardrobe and pay for a luxury penthouse. I thought about the night of the gala, when Julian called me a project in front of 200 people. He wasn't just being cruel. He was preparing the ground. He was making sure that if I ever tried to speak up, nobody would believe a word out of the mouth of a crazy girl. The conflict in the room shifted from a request for a signature to a scene of a silent crime. I felt a bubble of something rising in my chest. It wasn't the sob that Mr. Whitaker was clearly expecting. It wasn't the shaking hands of a victim. It was a sharp, jagged realization of the absolute absurdity of the Sterling family's desperation. I began to laugh. It started as a low, dry sound in my throat before it erupted into a clear, resonant laugh that bounced off the walls of my quiet home. I laughed until my ribs ached and my eyes watered. It was the sound of a woman who had finally seen the punchline of a 20-year joke. The lawyer actually jumped, his hand fluttering to his tie as he stared at me in genuine alarm. He looked like he was ready to call for an ambulance or a priest. He asked me what was so funny, and I looked him dead in the eye while I tapped my finger against the forged signature. I asked him if he had personally witnessed me signing this waiver 2 years ago. He stammered that he hadn't been the primary counsel at that time, but that the document was notarized and part of the official record. I told him that was fascinating because on the date this document was allegedly signed in Houston, I was actually scrubbed into a 12-hour surgical shift in Austin, where I was being commended for my work on a multi-car trauma. I watched the blood drain from his face until his skin matched the ivory color of the trust documents. The silence that followed was absolute. The layers of the Sterling family's deception were finally being stripped back in real time. My sister Savannah wasn't just a golden child, she was a thief in a $5,000 dress. My parents weren't just neglectful, they were co-conspirators who had gambled their remaining social capital on the hope that I would never look at the back pages of a legal exhibit. They had bet everything on the idea that I was as dumb and unstable as they told everyone I was. But I am a nurse. I am trained to follow the data. I am trained to look at the chart and see where the error began. And the error began the moment they decided that my life was a resource for them to harvest. The conflict intensified as Mr. Whitaker tried to reclaim the narrative. He began to talk about the importance of family unity and how a public dispute would only hurt everyone involved. He mentioned Julian's precarious health and Claire's fragile nerves. He was using the same weaponized vulnerability that had kept me a prisoner in their house for 18 years. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't the child who would apologize for making them uncomfortable. I stood up and handed the entire Manila envelope back to him. I didn't sign the new dissolution request. I didn't sign anything at all. I told him that he could tell my father that the mentally unstable daughter had decided to perform a forensic audit of the family's history. I walked him to the door, feeling the shift in power with every step. Mr. Whitaker looked small now, his expensive suit unable to hide the fact that he was representing a sinking ship. He tried one last time to convince me to cooperate, suggesting that the energy company's offer was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would benefit the entire Sterling legacy. I told him that I was no longer interested in the Sterling legacy. I was only interested in the truth. As he walked toward his car, I saw him pull out his phone and his hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. I knew who he was calling. He was calling Julian to tell him that the project had finally started talking back. I closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment, listening to the sound of my own heart beating in the quiet foyer. The laughter was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I wasn't going to just say no to their request. I was going to dismantle the entire infrastructure of their lies. I realized that my parents hadn't just run out of people to exploit. They had finally tried to exploit the one person who knew exactly how to track their movements. I picked up my own phone and called my husband Mark. I told him to come home because we needed to prepare for a different kind of trial. The conflict was no longer a private family matter. It was a war of records, and the Sterling family had no idea that I had been keeping the receipts for 33 years. As the sun began to set over Austin, I felt a new, stronger conflict rising in my chest. It was the thrill of the hunt. My parents wanted a signature, but what they were going to get was a reckoning that would make that Houston gala look like a birthday party. To understand why that laugh felt like a jagged piece of glass in my throat, you have to understand the environment that raised me. I sat on my sofa in Austin staring at the forged signature on the trust documents, and the ink seemed to bleed into a series of stinging memories from a childhood defined by leftovers. In the Sterling household, value was never something you were born with. It was something my father Julian assigned to you based on how well you reflected his own ego. Savannah was his masterpiece. When she turned 16, a black BMW with a massive red bow appeared in the driveway, while I was handed the keys to a hand-me-down sedan with a slipping transmission and a smell of old fast food that no amount of scrubbing could erase. My sister had private tutors from Princeton who cost $300 an hour to ensure her grades matched her social standing. I was given a used laptop with a flickering screen and told that a girl with my modest intellect should simply be grateful for the scraps. Julian used the family image like a tactical weapon, and I was always the collateral damage. I remember a humid July morning 3 years before I left when the entire family was packing for an all-expenses-paid resort in Cabo San Lucas. I had my bag ready by the door, hoping that for once I might be included in the family photo on the beach. My mother Claire didn't even look at me as she handed me a printed itinerary for Savannah's toddlers. She told me that since I didn't have a real career or a husband to tie me down, I would be staying behind to manage the house and the children. My father stood in the foyer checking his gold watch and told me I had nothing better to do. He said it was an opportunity for me to prove I could be useful for once. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a resource. They saw a person whose time and dreams had zero market value in the sterling economy. This was the foundation of the invisibility I lived in for nearly 3 decades. The conflict of my youth wasn't just about the physical things I lacked, but the psychological space I wasn't allowed to occupy. Savannah was encouraged to be loud and demanding and ambitious, because those traits were seen as signs of leadership. When I showed the same drive, it was labeled as being difficult or unstable. I remember winning a regional science fair in high school and bringing the trophy home with a heart full of hope. Julian looked at the gold plastic statue and then looked at Savannah's cheerleading schedule for the weekend. He told me to put the trophy in the garage because it didn't fit the aesthetic of the living room. He said that focusing on such academic pursuits made me seem cold and unapproachable. He wanted a daughter who was a decorative accessory, and when I chose to become a trauma nurse, he treated it as a personal insult to his status. That graduation text message was the final confirmation of my status as an afterthought. While Savannah's real estate license was celebrated with a dinner that cost more than my annual rent. I sat alone in a folding chair at my nursing school commencement. I looked for their faces in the sea of proud parents and saw only empty air. The text from Julian arrived just as I was walking across the stage to receive my degree with honors. He didn't say he was proud. He didn't even say congratulations. He said they were busy celebrating a major commission Savannah had earned and that I should find my own way home. I sat in my car in the parking lot and realized that I was sitting in a vehicle they had given me only because they didn't want the neighbors to see a sterling child walking. Every gift had a hook and every silence was a message. Now as I held the proof of their forgery in my hands, the laughter returned because the irony was finally complete. They had spent 20 years telling me I was the dumb one, and the slow one, and the one who couldn't be trusted with the family legacy. Yet here they were 5 years after disowning me, desperately forging my name, because I was the only person who actually owned the piece of land that could save them from the consequences of their own greed. Savannah had used the $450,000 they stole from my education fund to play at being a mogul, and she had lost every cent. My parents had gambled their retirement on the golden child's hollow ambition, and now they were drowning. The girl they called a project was the only one with the keys to the lifeboats. The conflict intensified as I realized that the mentally unstable label wasn't just a way to hurt my feelings. It was a calculated legal precaution. If Julian could convince the Sterling law firm and the bank trustees that I was undergoing long-term psychiatric treatment, he could bypass the need for my physical presence. He could sign my name and claim he was acting as my guardian. He had turned my career as a nurse against me, suggesting that my high-stress job had finally caused a breakdown. He had taken my strength and rewritten it as a fatal flaw. I looked at the lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, who was still waiting for me to sign the new papers, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He realized that the narrative was collapsing. He realized that the woman in front of him wasn't a fragile victim, but a woman who had been forged in the fire of their neglect. I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out a file folder I had been keeping for 5 years. It contained every payslip, every commendation, and every record of my presence in Austin. I had a paper trail that proved I was never unstable and I was never in a facility. I was busy working 48-hour weeks and saving lives while my family was busy inventing a tragedy to cover their theft. I told Mr. Whitaker that he should inform my father that I would not be signing the dissolution papers. I told him that I would be conducting my own investigation into the Julian and Claire family trust. The lawyer started to protest about the urgency of the energy lease, but I cut him off. I told him that my time was suddenly very expensive and that Julian could no longer afford it. As I escorted him to the door, I felt a new conflict rising. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that they were still trying to use me to protect Savannah. Even after she stole my future, my parents were willing to commit a felony to keep her from facing the truth of her own failure. They were willing to sacrifice my reputation and my freedom to ensure that the golden child never had to apologize. I watched Mr. Whitaker's car disappear down the street, And I knew that the next phone call wouldn't be from a lawyer. It would be from my mother. She would use the sweet voice she used for charity events, and she would try to guilt me back into the fold. She would talk about family being the most important thing, while ignoring the fact that she had treated me like a stranger for 5 years. I picked up the documents and looked at the West Texas land tract one more time. It was 500 acres of scrub and dust, but to me it was the physical proof that my grandmother Pearl had loved me. She had known what kind of man her son was, and she had tried to give me a shield. My parents had tried to turn that shield into a weapon against me, but they had forgotten one thing. I am a trauma nurse. I don't panic when things get messy. I just start cleaning. I called Mark and told him that the Sterling family was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the child you tried to erase. The conflict was shifting from a legal dispute to a total war for my identity, and I was ready to take up all the space they had denied me. I stood there in the center of my Austin living room, feeling the air turn frigid as the full weight of the Sterling family's depravity finally anchored itself in my chest. For years, I had treated Julian's comments about my mental health as the pathetic ramblings of a man who couldn't handle a daughter he couldn't control. I thought calling me unstable was just his way of explaining away why I didn't want to spend my weekends at the country club, or why I preferred the adrenaline of a trauma bay to the staged perfection of a Houston garden party. But as I stared at the forged waiver of interest in that manila envelope, I realized that I had been tragically naive. The mentally unstable label wasn't just a social insult designed to sting at dinner parties. It was a meticulously crafted legal strategy. It was the foundation of a criminal infrastructure designed to erase my agency and harvest my assets while I was busy living my own life. If the board of directors and the bank trustees truly believed that the younger Sterling daughter was incapacitated, they wouldn't pause for a single second to question a signature provided on her behalf. They would view Julian and Claire not as thieves, but as burdened parents performing a difficult duty for a sick child. I looked at Mr. Whitaker, who was now sweating through his custom-tailored shirt, and I felt a surge of cold clinical fury. I asked him a very specific question. I asked if my father had explicitly told the Sterling law firm that I was currently residing in a long-term care facility. The lawyer shifted his weight and adjusted his glasses, his eyes darting toward the door as if he were looking for an exit strategy that didn't exist. He finally cleared his throat and admitted that Julian had described my situation as receiving intensive and prolonged medical intervention that required the family to manage my legal affairs to avoid further stress on my fragile system. The conflict escalated from simple personal neglect to a massive criminal conspiracy involving my very identity. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my sanity in the eyes of the law. Julian had used my profession as a nurse to build the lie, suggesting that the high-pressure environment of the emergency room had finally caused a total psychological collapse. He had taken my greatest strength, my ability to remain calm in a crisis, and rewritten it as a fatal symptom. He told the bank that I was a danger to myself, and that my silence over the last 5 years was proof of my withdrawal from reality. Every milestone I achieved in Austin, and every patient I saved, was being used as a shadow narrative to justify my parents' access to my grandmother's land. I thought back to the childhood of scraps, where I was always told to be grateful for the leftovers, while Savannah was treated like royalty. I realized then that the hierarchy was never just about favoritism. It was about creating a profile. By making me the invisible one and the difficult one, they had ensured that when the time came to declare me unstable, nobody in their social circle would even think to check on me. They would just nod and say it was such a shame about Caroline, but thank goodness Julian was there to handle things. They had turned my entire existence into a cautionary tale to serve as the smokescreen for their financial desperation. Savannah's Dallas brokerage was a black hole for cash, and my parents had decided that my inheritance was the only thing that could fill it. The conflict deepened as I realized the sheer scale of the forgery. If they had forged this waiver 2 years ago, what else had they signed my name to? How many other sub-trusts had been emptied? How many corporate resolutions had been passed with a fake Caroline Sterling signature? I felt like I was looking at a medical chart where every vital sign had been fabricated by a doctor who wanted to hide a malpractice suit. I told Mr. Whitaker that I was no longer interested in the energy lease or the trust dissolution. I told him that I was going to contact the Texas Board of Nursing and the State Bar, because my professional license was now in jeopardy, thanks to my father's lies. If a hospital board found out that a senior nurse coordinator was allegedly in a long-term care facility for mental instability, my career would be over in 24 hours. Mr. Whitaker tried to backtrack, claiming that there had been a misunderstanding of terms and that Julian only wanted to protect me. He started talking about the family legacy again, but I cut him off with a single look. I told him that the only legacy Julian had left was a paper trail of fraud. I reached for my phone and started scrolling through my own records. I showed the lawyer my employment contract, my tax returns, and the award I received last month for excellence in trauma care. I asked him how a woman in a psychiatric facility managed to maintain a full-time position and lead a team of 20 nurses. The silence in the room was deafening. The lawyer realized that he wasn't just dealing with a disgruntled daughter. He was dealing with a witness who had documented every second of her supposed insanity. The layers of the Sterling family's betrayal were finally fully exposed. My mother Claire had been the one to call the bank and play the role of the grieving mother. She had used her sweet charity gala voice to convince the trustees that her poor daughter was unable to speak for herself. She had co-signed the narrative that allowed my sister to buy a penthouse with money meant for my future. They had gambled everything on the belief that I would never find out. They thought that since they had disowned me, I would never have a reason to look at the Julian and Claire family trust again. They thought their silence was my silence. But they had forgotten that silence can also be the sound of someone building a case. I told Mr. Whitaker that he should inform Julian that I would be conducting a forensic audit of every single document associated with the Sterling name. I told him that if I found one more forged signature or one more lie about my medical status, I would skip the family meeting and go straight to the district attorney. The lawyer looked at his briefcase and then at me, and I saw the realization hit him that he was on the wrong side of a very dangerous line. He stood up, his angles now looking sharp and brittle. He didn't offer a gold pen this time. He just wanted to leave before I started asking about his own complicity in the filing of forged documents. As the door closed behind him, I felt a new, stronger conflict rising in my chest. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a cold, calculating ambition. I was going to dismantle the Julian and Claire family trust brick by brick. I was going to find every cent they had siphoned into Savannah's hollow success, and I was going to bring it back into the light. My parents wanted a signature to save their reputation, but what they were going to get was a public audit of their souls. I realized that my father, Julian, hadn't just run out of people to exploit. He had finally tried to exploit the one person who knew exactly how to track his every move. I called Mark and told him that the war had moved from the living room to the boardroom and that I needed him to help me find a lawyer who didn't care about the Sterling name. The surprising ending of this confrontation was the realization that Julian hadn't just been lying to me. He had been lying to the energy company too. They were under the impression that the land title was clear because of my waiver. If they found out the signature was forged, they would pull the $2 million offer and sue the Sterlings for breach of contract. My parents weren't just facing a family dispute. They were facing total financial and legal annihilation, and the only person who could save them was the unstable daughter they had spent 5 years trying to erase. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the clock. The Sterling family empire was ticking down to zero, and I was the only one who knew how to stop the clock or let it strike midnight. The manila envelope sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb, and the more I read, the more I realized that the blast radius was far larger than a few $100,000. The primary document concerned a 500-acre tract of land in the Permian Basin of West Texas. To an outsider, it is just a vast expanse of scrub brush and caliche dust, but in the world of Texas energy, it is the equivalent of a gold mine. This land was a legacy from my grandmother Pearl, who was the only person in the Sterling family who ever looked at me and saw the steel under the quiet. She was a woman who had survived the Depression and two oil booms, and she knew exactly how to spot a predator, even if he was her own son. Pearl had left that specific acreage to me in a secret codicil to her will because she knew Julian would try to leverage everything for Savannah's benefit. Julian and Claire believed they had successfully suppressed that document after Pearl passed away, but they hadn't accounted for the fact that energy companies have better investigators than the Houston Social Registry. My parents were desperate for my signature now because a major global energy conglomerate had offered a lease for the mineral rights totaling $2.2 million. It was a life-changing sum of money that would have erased every debt Savannah had accumulated in her disastrous real estate ventures. But the title company had performed a deep dive into the chain of custody, and they had flagged the 2021 waiver of interest as a high-risk forgery. The entire deal was frozen, and the energy company was threatening to walk away if the title wasn't cleared by Friday at noon. My parents weren't just asking for help, they were begging for a miracle to cover their tracks before the law caught up to them. I sat back and looked at the map of the property. I remembered being 6 years old and walking that land with Pearl while she pointed out the different types of cactus and told me that the ground underneath us was full of secrets. She told me to never let anyone tell me I was less than because I came from the earth, and the earth never lies. Julian, however, viewed that land as a piggy bank. He didn't care about the heritage or the woman who had worked her fingers to the bone to keep it. He only cared about the liquidity. He had spent decades treating me like a backup plan, and now he was shocked that the backup plan had developed her own agency. The conflict in my chest was no longer about the money, it was about the desecration of Pearl's final wishes. They hadn't just stolen from me, they had betrayed the one person who had tried to save me. The drama escalated as I realized the absolute panic my father must be in. If the energy company pulled their offer, the bank would move to foreclose on the Houston estate within 30 days. Julian had bet the entire Sterling legacy on a lie, and now the lie was being audited by a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I thought about the childhood of scraps and the way they told me I should be grateful for the leftovers, while they were busy planning to steal a multi-million-dollar inheritance from right under my feet. They had counted on my instability as a permanent condition. They had assumed that even if I did find out, I would be too fragile to fight back. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and my absence for defeat. But being a trauma nurse means you are trained to handle the most aggressive personalities in the most desperate situations. I have stood my ground against intoxicated giants and grieving families, and I have never once blinked. I looked at the gold pen Mr. Whitaker had left behind, and I felt a cold, calculating clarity. I wasn't going to sign that document because signing it would be a validation of their crime. I was going to use that $2.2 million lease as the ultimate leverage. I was going to force my father to admit exactly what he had done in front of the very board members he had lied to. I wanted the narrative of my instability to be publicly dismantled by the very person who had invented it. The layers of this Texas land grab were deeper than just mineral rights. I discovered a secondary filing that showed Julian had tried to use the land as collateral for a private loan to cover Savannah's mounting legal fees in Dallas. He was double leveraging an asset he didn't even own. He was a man drowning in his own hubris, and he was trying to pull me under with him. I realized then that the reason they skipped my graduation and excluded me from the photos wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about distance. They needed me to stay in the shadows so I wouldn't notice the light reflecting off the money they were taking from me. They had created a ghost so they could inherit the ghost's estate. I called Sarah again and told her to look into the title company's report. I wanted to know the name of the investigator who flagged the 2021 signature. If I could get a copy of their formal finding, I would have the forensic proof I needed to file a criminal complaint. Sarah told me that the title company was already asking questions about my whereabouts and that Julian had told them I was in an out-of-state sanitarium. The rage I felt was no longer hot, it was a freezing absolute zero. They were still using the same lie while trying to get the same signature. It was a cycle of abuse that only a legal intervention could break. The conflict deepened when I received a frantic voicemail from Savannah. Her voice was high and jagged, and she sounded like a woman whose world was coming to an end. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize for the 5 years of silence. She told me that I was being incredibly selfish, and that if I didn't sign the papers, Mom and Dad would lose everything. She said that family was supposed to support each other, and that my grandmother would be ashamed of me for holding the family hostage over a piece of dirt. The audacity of her words was almost breathtaking. She was living in a penthouse bought with my stolen equity, and she was calling me selfish. I realized then that the Sterling family didn't have a moral compass. They had a profit margin. If I signed, I would be complicit in their fraud. If I didn't sign, I would be the person who brought down the house. It was a classic lose-lose scenario designed by a master manipulator. But Julian had forgotten that Pearl had raised me too. He had forgotten about the steel under the quiet. I picked up the map and the documents, and I drove to the one person in Houston who I knew still had a shred of integrity, my father's oldest business partner, who had been a pallbearer at Pearl's funeral. I was going to bypass Julian entirely and start talking to the people who held the real power. The surprising ending to this part of the struggle was the discovery that the energy company hadn't just found a forgery, they had found a second codicil. A document that was triggered only if the land was ever sold or leased without my express written and notarized consent. My grandmother had anticipated their greed with the precision of a chess master. If the lease went through without my genuine signature, the entire value of the contract would be forfeited to a charitable trust, effectively leaving my parents with nothing. Pearl hadn't just left me land, she had left me a trap for the people who tried to steal it. I sat in my car and looked at the rolling hills of Austin, and for the first time, I felt like Pearl was standing right there beside me. The hunt was no longer just about survival, it was about the absolute restoration of the truth, and the Sterling family was about to find out that the dumb daughter was the only one who could read the fine print. I sat in my dimly lit kitchen in Austin, with the West Texas land documents spread across the table like a map of a battlefield. The clinical detachment I had cultivated as a trauma nurse kicked in, overriding the visceral urge to scream at the ceiling. I didn't reach for my phone to call Julian and demand an explanation he would only lie about. Instead, I reached for my secret weapon. Her name is Sarah, and we met during my second year of nursing school when she was finishing her master's in forensic accounting. While I was learning to read the subtle fluctuations of a heart monitor, Sarah was learning to read the rhythmic pulse of hidden bank accounts and the jagged lines of shell companies. I sent her a high-resolution scan of the forged 2021 waiver and the Permian Basin property records, and I told her I needed to know where the blood was flowing. In exactly 48 hours, Sarah called me back with a tone of voice that was both impressed and disgusted. She had performed a surgical deep dive into the public filings and the accessible trust reporting. What she found was a masterclass in financial parasitic behavior. It turned out that Savannah's meteoric rise as a Dallas real estate mogul wasn't fueled by her sharp eye for properties or her legendary negotiation skills. It was fueled by a series of massive cash injections totaling $450,000. Every single dollar of that money had been siphoned directly from the equity in my grandmother Pearl's land, facilitated by that forged waiver of interest. My parents hadn't just stolen a future education fund. They had harvested my primary asset to subsidize Savannah's high-rise office and her penchant for designer labels. The conflict deepened as Sarah outlined the sheer desperation behind these transfers. My parents were not just being greedy, they were broke. The Sterling family lifestyle in Houston was a hollowed-out shell, a facade of white pillars and country club memberships held together by predatory loans and second mortgages. Julian had leveraged the Houston estate to the maximum limit to pay for Savannah's failed development projects and her lifestyle. The 500 acres of West Texas scrubland was literally the only unencumbered asset left in the entire Sterling portfolio. That $2.2 million oil lease wasn't just a payday, it was their only exit strategy. If I didn't sign that document, The bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the family home within 30 days, and the Golden Child's Dallas brokerage would collapse like a house of cards. Sarah explained that Savannah's company had survived for 3 years solely because Julian was using my forged consent to pull equity as needed. Whenever a listing failed to sell or a loan payment came due, they simply dipped into the Pearl assets and told the trustees I was too mentally unstable to object. I sat there listening to the quantifiable data of my own betrayal. It is one thing to feel overlooked at a gala, but it is a completely different sensation to see your life's value listed as a line item on a balance sheet used to save a sister who didn't even like you. I felt a cold, calculating resolve settle into my bones. The girl they called a project had just become the only person with the power to stop their financial heart from flatlining. The conflict intensified when I realized the extent of the institutional gaslighting Julian had employed. To move that much money without a power of attorney, he had submitted a fabricated medical evaluation to the trust bank. He had found a doctor, likely a golf partner, or someone who owed him a favor to sign a letter suggesting I was undergoing long-term psychiatric treatment for a total nervous breakdown. He had used my own career as a nurse to build the lie claiming I had become addicted to hospital-grade sedatives to cope with the stress of the ER. He had destroyed my professional reputation in the eyes of the financial world to ensure his own survival. If the Texas Board of Nursing ever saw that letter, I would lose my license in an afternoon. I asked Sarah if we could trace the specific accounts where the money was currently sitting. She told me that most of it had already been spent on Savannah's operating costs and a series of questionable investments Julian made in a failed tech startup. There was almost nothing left in the immediate accounts. They were living on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the energy company's check to pull them back from the brink. The $2.2 million was the only thing standing between the Sterlings and total social annihilation. Julian had bet everything on the idea that I would be too cowed by the Sterling law firm to ask for a forensic audit. He assumed I was still the girl who would accept the used laptop and stay quiet. I thought about Mark, my husband, who was currently at the courthouse, defending people who had stolen far less than my father. I thought about the way Julian had called him a downgrade. I realized that the real downgrade was the man sitting in the Houston estate, forging his daughter's name because he couldn't admit he had failed as a provider. The layers of the conflict were now fully visible. It was a war of records versus a war of reputations. I told Sarah to prepare a formal report and to keep the digital trail ready for a process server. I wasn't just going to say no to the signature. I was going to use the signature to seize control of the entire family narrative. The drama shifted when I received a text message from a cousin who still followed Savannah on social media. She sent me a screenshot of Savannah at a luxury spa in Dallas, captioned with the phrase, "Exciting new beginnings coming next week, grateful for family support." The sheer audacity of the post was breathtaking. My sister was being grateful for a future she had stolen from me. She was celebrating the theft before the ink was even dry on the lease. The conflict was no longer a private family matter. It was a public performance of theft, and I was being cast as the invisible benefactor, who was too crazy to know she was being robbed. I realized then that my parents didn't just want a signature. They wanted me to remain a ghost. If I signed, I would be validating every lie they ever told about me. I would be saying that Julian was right to call me unstable. I would be saying that Savannah deserved my life more than I did. I looked at the clinical data on my screen and the West Texas land tract on my table. I wasn't going to play the ghost anymore. I was going to be the auditor who brought their entire world to a halt. I called Mr. Whitaker and told him that I would be attending the family dinner in Houston, but I wouldn't be coming alone. I told him my advisor would be bringing the necessary paperwork. The surprising ending to this strategic consultation was Sarah's discovery of a clause in the energy company's standard lease agreement. If any fraud or title dispute was discovered after the funds were dispersed, the company had the right to claw back the money from the individual signer's personal assets, including their primary residence. Julian was walking into a trap he didn't even understand. By forging my signature 2 years ago, he had already invalidated the chain of title. If I signed now to fix it, I would be legally co-signing the original fraud. He wasn't asking me to help him, he was asking me to jump into the fire with him. I sat in the Austin moonlight and felt the ghost of my grandmother Pearl in the room. The steel under the quiet was now the only thing I had left, and I was going to use it to perform a total liquidation of the Sterling family's lies. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was charting a particularly difficult case in the nurses' station. I didn't recognize the number, but the Houston area code sent a familiar chill down my spine. I answered, and the voice that greeted me was like a ghost draped in expensive perfume. It was my mother Claire calling for the first time in exactly 1,825 days. Her tone was dripping with a manufactured warmth that felt like corn syrup, thick sweet, and utterly artificial. She didn't open with an apology for the 5 years of silence or ask about my life in Austin. Instead, she cooed about how much she missed her darling girl and how life was too short to hold on to old misunderstandings. It was the performance of a lifetime, the same voice she used when she was chairing a charity committee and needed a six-figure donation from a reluctant socialite. Claire told me that Julian was feeling reflective and that they wanted to move past the nonsense of the past. She said they were hosting an intimate family dinner at the Houston estate on Saturday, and that it was time for us to be a real family again. Every time she used that word family, I felt the forged signature of Savannah burning a hole in my memory. I knew exactly why the phone was finally ringing. They had run out of time and the energy company was breathing down their necks for that $2 million lease. They needed me to walk into that white-pillared house and play the role of the dutiful daughter long enough to sign away my grandmother's legacy. I sat there listening to her talk about the menu and the vintage wine they had pulled from the cellar, and I realized that to them, I was still just a resource to be managed. The conflict in my chest was a battle between the girl who once craved their approval and the woman who now held their financial lives in her hands. My mother's sudden interest in reconciliation was a calculated maneuver, a desperate attempt to use emotional leverage where legal threats had failed. She spoke about Savannah's children and how they were asking for their Aunt Wendy as if she hadn't spent years helping my sister coordinate my exclusion in their secret group chat. She was weaponizing my own empathy against me, trying to make me feel guilty for the distance that Julian had created with a single text message 5 years ago. I realized then that my parents didn't just want my signature, they wanted my compliance. They wanted me to pretend that the last 5 years were just a dream so they could continue their nightmare of greed. I didn't argue and I didn't point out the hypocrisy. I simply told her that I would be there on Saturday. I could practically hear the relief exhaled through the receiver, a sound of a woman who thought she had successfully closed a difficult deal. But then I added a single condition. I told her that I would be bringing a guest, my personal advisor. The silence on the other end of the line was instantaneous. Claire's voice sharpened slightly, the sweetness curdling into suspicion. She asked why I would need an advisor for a private family dinner, and I told her that since we were discussing the Julian and Claire family trust, it was only professional to have my own representation present. I told her that if we were going to be a real family, then we should start with total transparency. The tension escalated when she tried to push back, suggesting that an outsider would ruin the intimate atmosphere they were trying to cultivate. She talked about privacy and how Julian was sensitive about his business dealings being discussed in front of strangers. I stood my ground using the same calm, authoritative tone I use with aggressive surgeons in the operating room. I told her that if my advisor wasn't welcome, then I wouldn't be attending. I watched the power dynamic shift in real time as she realized that she no longer held the keys to the kingdom. She finally agreed, her voice brittle and cold, as she told me they would see us at 7 o'clock. As I hung up, I felt a new conflict rising. I wasn't just going to a dinner, I was going to an audit. I spent the next 48 hours coordinating with Sarah, my forensic accountant, and the lawyer I had hired to represent my interests. We weren't just going to Houston to talk about a land lease, we were going to present the evidence of the $450,000 they had already stolen from my grandmother's estate. I thought about the childhood of Scraps and the way they had told me I was the dumb one while they were busy liquidating my future to fund Savannah's lies. I thought about the text message Julian sent on my graduation day and the way he laughed at the gala when he called me unstable. They had spent 30 years trying to make me small, and now they were about to find out exactly how much space I could take up. My advisor wasn't just a lawyer, he was a specialist in fiduciary fraud. He had spent his career dismantling the kind of entitled corruption my father Julian practiced as a religion. We reviewed the bank records Sarah had unearthed, tracing the flow of my stolen equity into Savannah's failing brokerage. Every dollar was documented, every transfer was time-stamped. We had the receipts for the luxury cars, the penthouse rent, and the designer clothes that my sister had purchased with money meant for my education. The layers of their betrayal were so thick they were almost tangible. My parents had gambled the entire sterling legacy on a golden child who was nothing more than a polished thief. The conflict intensified as I prepared for the drive to Houston. Mark wanted to come with me, but I told him I needed to do this part of the journey alone. This wasn't just about the money, it was about the restoration of my own name. I needed to look my father in the eye and show him that the project he tried to erase had become the architect of his downfall. I packed my grandmother Pearl's diary and the folder of medical records that proved I was never unstable. I was armed with the truth, and the truth is the only thing a man like Julian Sterling truly fears. I knew that the moment I stepped into that house, the managed narrative of the last 5 years would begin to shatter. I thought about the secret group chat where they had sent nearly 3,000 messages mocking my life in Austin. I realized that they probably had a new thread going right now discussing how to handle me at dinner. They likely thought they could charm me or intimidate me into signing the papers before the energy company's deadline on Monday. They had no idea that I already knew about the $2 million lease or the title company's forgery flag. They were walking into the dinner thinking they were the hunters, but they were actually the ones being audited. The daughter they called free help was about to present them with a bill they could never pay. As I crossed the city limits into Houston, the heat and humidity of my childhood felt like a physical weight. I drove past the country club where they had celebrated Savannah's milestones while ignoring mine. I saw the elite private schools and the high-end boutiques that served as the backdrop for the Sterling family's staged perfection. I realized that for 28 years I had tried to fit into this world, and for 5 years I had tried to forget it. But tonight I was returning as a visitor from the reality they had tried to deny. I wasn't the unstable daughter anymore. I was the sole ethical heir, and I was bringing the fire. The surprising ending to this invitation was the realization that my mother Claire had already told the extended family I was coming back to apologize. She had leaked the news to her bridge club and her sisters, claiming that I had finally realized how much I needed them. She was still trying to manage the image even as the foundation was rotting away. She wanted my arrival to be a public victory for the Sterling brand, a narrative of a wayward daughter returning to the fold. I sat in my car outside the estate gates and felt the steel under the quiet crystallize. I wasn't going in there to seek forgiveness. I was going in there to execute a vote of no confidence. The dinner was served, and the Sterling family was about to lose their seat at the table. The drive from Austin to Houston usually takes about 3 hours, but as I crossed the city limits, the air began to feel heavy and thick with the familiar humidity of my childhood. I steered my reliable sedan toward the neighborhood where every lawn is manicured to within an inch of its life, and every house looks like a monument to a legacy that no longer exists. I pulled up to the Sterling estate, a massive white pillared colonial that stood at the end of a long circular driveway. To anyone driving by, it looked like the ultimate symbol of American success, but as I looked at the slight peeling of the paint on the upper shutters, I knew the truth. This house was a hollowed-out shell, a beautiful facade that was slowly rotting under the crushing weight of my parents' financial choices and my sister's failed ambitions. I sat in the car for a full minute before opening the door. I was wearing my best professional charcoal suit, tailored and sharp. It was the armor of a woman who had built her own world without a single dime of sterling oil money. Hidden on my lapel was the tiny gold excellence in trauma nursing pin I had received at the hospital last year. My parents would never see it, but its presence against my heart was a reminder of who I actually was. I wasn't the unstable daughter returning for a handout. I was the coordinator of a Level 1 trauma center, and I was here to perform a total audit of a sinking ship. My advisor sat in the passenger seat beside me checking his watch. He didn't need to say anything. We both knew that the people inside that house had no idea the flood was already at their doorstep. As we walked up the stone steps, the front door swung open, and there stood Savannah. She looked as if she had stepped directly out of a high-end fashion magazine wearing a silk wrap dress that I knew for a fact cost $5,000. It was a shimmering emerald green, the color of envy and greed. She was leaning against the doorframe with the same dismissive smirk she had worn at the Petroleum Club gala 5 years ago. She didn't offer a hug or a hello. She just looked at my sensible suit and my Austin license plates and let out a soft laugh that was meant to make me feel small. She told me it was sweet that I had finally decided to come home and help the family, but that I looked like I had been spending too much time in the hospital cafeteria. The conflict in the air was immediate and jagged. Savannah reached out to touch my shoulder, but I stepped back before her hand could land. I didn't return the smile. I looked at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, the one Sarah had traced back to a withdrawal from the Pearl Subtrust, and I felt a cold clarity. She was standing there in a dress bought with forged funds at a party, in a house they were about to lose, and she still thought she was the one in control. She whispered that the Harringtons were asking about me, and that I should try to keep my erratic behavior to a minimum tonight, so she could close her next big deal. She was still managing me, still treating me like a project that needed to be contained. I followed her into the grand foyer where the air was chilled to a precise 70 degrees. My mother Claire appeared from the dining room, her face a mask of practiced joy. She rushed toward me, her heels clicking on the marble floors that Julian had mortgaged twice over. She threw her arms around me and breathed the scent of expensive lilies and desperation into my hair. She told me she was so glad her darling girl was back and that Julian was waiting in the study. But her eyes were darting toward my advisor, trying to calculate his net worth by the cut of his jacket. She asked if he was a new boyfriend, and I told her he was my legal counsel. The joy on her face didn't fade, it just became more brittle as she ushered us toward the dining room where a massive mahogany table was set for a feast of lies. The layers of the Sterling house were shifting before my eyes. In the dining room, my father Julian sat at the head of the table, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand. He looked older than I remembered, his skin looking like parchment under the light of the chandelier. He stood up slowly, trying to maintain the authority of a patriarch, while the ceiling above him was literally leaking debt. He welcomed me back with a rehearsed warmth that didn't reach his eyes. He pointed at the seat at the far end of the table, the one closest to the kitchen doors. It was the traditional place for the help or the afterthought. He was trying to reestablish the hierarchy before the first course was even served. The conflict deepened as I ignored his direction and sat in the chair directly to his right, the seat reserved for the most important guest. I gestured for my advisor to sit next to me. Julian's jaw tightened, and the ice in his glass clinked as his hand gave a slight tremor. He told me that we were having a family dinner, and that business could wait until after the dessert. He wanted to use the next hour to soften me up with stories of my grandmother and the importance of blood loyalty. He wanted to remind me of the scraps they had given me, so I would feel obligated to sign away the feast I had actually earned. Savannah sat opposite me, her emerald dress catching the light as she began to talk about her Dallas real estate empire. She spoke about high-rise developments and celebrity clients as if she were a titan of industry. But every time she mentioned a closing, I saw my advisor take a small notebook out and make a quiet notation. We knew that for every dollar she claimed to have made, Julian had siphoned two from my West Texas land. She was a puppet in a designer dress, and my father was the one pulling the strings with a forged pen. The tension at the table was a living thing, a cord being pulled tighter and tighter with every false laugh and every empty toast. My mother, Claire, began to recount a story about a summer we spent in the Hamptons, conveniently forgetting that I had been left at home to study while Savannah went to yachting camp. She spoke about the Sterling legacy as if it were a sacred trust, ignoring the fact that she had spent the last 5 years helping Julian tell the world I was mentally unstable. She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes and asked if I remembered how much I loved the white roses in the garden. She was trying to trigger a childhood nostalgia to make me vulnerable, but all I saw was a woman who had co-signed my erasure. I sat there in my charcoal suit, the trauma nurse who had seen the worst of humanity, and realized that the people across from me were far more dangerous than any patient I had ever treated. The drama escalated when Julian finally set his glass down and looked at the manila envelope sitting on the sideboard. He told me that he was proud of the woman I had become, and that he wanted to ensure my future was secure. He said that the West Texas land was a burden for a single woman in Austin, and that by signing the dissolution papers, I would be setting myself up for life. He was still using the unstable playbook, suggesting that I wasn't capable of managing such a complex asset. He told me that the family would handle everything, and that all I had to do was trust him. Trust him. The man who disowned me by text, the man who forged my name, the man who treated my absence like a holiday. The ending of this arrival was a quiet moment of absolute realization. I looked around the room at the heavy velvet curtains and the silver platters, and I didn't see luxury. I saw a crime scene. I looked at Savannah's dismissive smirk, and I realized that she truly believed I was going to fold. She thought I was still the girl who would take the used laptop and stay quiet. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was the coordinator who knew how to audit a heartbeat, and I was about to audit her entire life. I reached for my water glass and looked at my father. I told him that I was glad we were all here because I had brought a few documents of my own to share. The Sterling House of Cards was about to meet a Texas wind, and for the first time in 33 years, I was the one holding the deck. The dining room of the Sterling estate felt like a stage where the actors had been rehearsing their lines for 5 years, but forgot that the audience had already seen the script. I sat in the chair to Julian's right, the heavy silver fork in my hand, feeling like a cold weight. The table was draped in a damask cloth, and set with the Wedgwood china, the delicate porcelain patterned with gold vines that I had spent my teenage years washing until my knuckles were raw and red. I was never allowed to eat off these plates because Claire insisted I was too clumsy and that one chipped rim would ruin the entire set. Now I watched her serve a roasted tenderloin onto my plate with a forced grace that made the fine china rattle against the mahogany. The irony was suffocating. They were finally treating me like a guest in a house where I had once been nothing more than the help. Julian stood at the head of the table, his wineglass catching the amber glow of the chandelier. He cleared his throat, a sound of practiced authority that used to make me shrink in my seat. He began a toast to family unity and the strength of the Sterling bond. He spoke about how the last 5 years were merely a period of reflection and how every family goes through a season of distance before returning to the fold. He looked at me with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, claiming that my return was the missing piece of their legacy. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a performance designed to erase half a decade of abandonment with a few sentences of polished rhetoric. He didn't mention the text message that disowned me or the gala where he called me a project. He acted as if those events were just figments of my erratic imagination. The conflict in the room was a thick, invisible fog. I looked at Savannah, who was sitting across from me in her emerald silk picking at her food with a bored expression. She chimed in telling me how glad she was that I was finally taking an interest in the family affairs again. She said that she had been carrying the burden of the estate alone for so long, and that she was exhausted from the pressure. She was playing the martyr, the overworked golden child who just wanted her sister back to share the load. But I knew the truth. She wasn't exhausted from work. She was exhausted from trying to hide the fact that she had burned through nearly $500,000 of my stolen equity. She was wearing a $5,000 dress, bought with my future, and she was asking for my sympathy. Julian didn't wait for the second course to reach for the manila envelope. He slid it across the white tablecloth with a flourish, the paper skidding toward my water glass like a baited trap. He told me that it was just a formality, a simple document to clean up some old estate matters that were cluttering the books. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine, and used the ultimate sterling weapon. He told me that blood is thicker than water, and that as a family, we had to protect our interests from outside interference. He was using the language of loyalty to demand my complicity. He wanted me to sign that paper so he could finalize the $2.2 million oil lease and cover the trail of forgeries Savannah had left behind. The tension escalated when Savannah leaned in, her voice dropped to a patronizing whisper. She told me that I shouldn't worry about the details because I wasn't cut out for this kind of business anyway. She suggested that a nurse's mind was better suited for following instructions than managing complex trusts. She said that by signing, I would be letting the professionals handle the stress so I could go back to my quiet little life in Austin without any worries. She was still trying to shrink me, still trying to convince me that I was the dumb one who needed her protection. She had no idea that the woman sitting across from her had just spent 48 hours auditing every cent she ever spent. I didn't touch the pen. I didn't even touch the envelope. I sat there and watched my mother Claire nod in agreement, her face a mask of fragile hope. She told me that this was the way things were supposed to be, and that after I signed, we could finally go back to being a real family. She spoke about the upcoming holiday season and how we could all go to the ranch together just like old times. She was painting a picture of a future that required me to be a victim one last time. She was asking me to co-sign my own erasure so she could keep her country club membership and her social standing. The conflict was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a total siege on my identity. The drama reached a new height when I looked at the advisor sitting beside me. Julian hadn't acknowledged him once since we sat down, treating him like an invisible piece of furniture. I gestured to the envelope and asked Julian if he had mentioned the title company's concerns to Mr. Whitaker. My father's hand gave a sharp, involuntary tremor, the scotch in his glass sloshing against the side. He tried to laugh it off, saying that title companies were always overly cautious and that it was nothing for me to worry about. He was still trying to manage the narrative, still trying to keep me from looking at the back pages. He didn't realize that I had already seen the 2021 forged waiver and that I knew exactly why he was sweating under the chandelier. Savannah's smirk began to falter as she realized I wasn't reaching for the pen. She asked me why I was being so difficult, and if this was another one of my episodes. She used the word episodes like a threat, a reminder of the unstable label they had spent 5 years polishing. She was trying to trigger my old insecurities, trying to make me feel as if questioning them was a symptom of my own illness. But I am a nurse. I know the difference between a breakdown and a breakthrough. I looked at her and saw a woman who was terrified that her sister had finally stopped playing the role of the scapegoat. I pushed the envelope back toward the center of the table. I told Julian that I wouldn't be signing anything until we discussed the $450,000 discrepancy in the Pearl Subtrust. The silence that followed was absolute, a physical weight that seemed to press the air out of the room. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, the gold-rimmed Wedgwood chiming like a funeral bell. Julian's face went from pale to a deep, dangerous crimson. He asked me where I got such a ridiculous number, and Savannah let out a shrill, nervous laugh. They were caught, and the only weapon they had left was to double down on the lie. The conflict suggested a new, even more dangerous path. Julian stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He told me that I was being ungrateful, and that after everything they had done for me, I was attacking the family over a bookkeeping error. He said that if I didn't sign the papers right now, he would be forced to reconsider my place in the trust entirely. He was trying to disown me a second time, using the same intimidation tactics he had used since I was a child. He didn't realize that you can't threaten someone with exile when they have already built their own kingdom. I stood up to match him, my charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the velvet and silk around me. I told him that I wasn't attacking the family. I was auditing a crime scene. I reached into my own bag and pulled out the report Sarah had prepared, the one that traced every dollar of my stolen equity into Savannah's failing brokerage. I told him that we weren't leaving until every person at this table acknowledged exactly whose money bought the dress Savannah was wearing. The dinner of lies was over, and the receipts were finally on the table. The next conflict wasn't going to be about a signature. It was going to be about the total unmasking of the sterling, golden child. I set my fork down on the edge of the Wedgwood china with a deliberate click that seemed to echo through the sudden stillness of the dining room. Julian was still leaning forward, his face a mask of expectant greed, his hand hovering near the manila envelope, as if he could already feel the weight of the oil money in his pocket. He was waiting for the compliant version of me to reappear, the one who would trade her inheritance for a crumb of family approval. But I didn't reach for the pen he had placed so carefully on the damask tablecloth. Instead, I reached for the thick manila envelope I had kept tucked under my chair. I pulled it out and placed it directly over the trust dissolution papers, effectively burying his lies under a mountain of data. I didn't start with an accusation. I started with a record. I pulled out the first document, an itemized statement of every wire transfer made from the Pearl Sub-Trust over the last 3 fiscal years. I laid it out in the center of the table, right next to the crystal bowl of floating candles. I watched Julian's eyes scan the numbers, and the way his pupils constricted told me he recognized the blood trail Sarah had found. My mother Claire reached for her wineglass, her hand trembling so violently that the stem clinked against her wedding ring. I told them that we were going to perform a forensic audit of the Sterling family dinner before anyone took another bite of the tenderloin. I moved to the second document, a high-resolution copy of the 2021 forged waiver. I pointed to the signature line where my name had been scrawled in Savannah's practiced, cramped hand. I looked at my sister, whose emerald silk dress suddenly looked like a costume she had outgrown. I told her that she had been very careful with the flourish on the end of the name, but she had forgotten that I have spent 10 years signing my name on legal medical records under the scrutiny of hospital administrators. I told the room that this piece of paper was not a family agreement. It was a felony. The conflict in the room shifted from a request for help into a high-stakes interrogation. Julian tried to find his voice, his chest heaving under his blazer. He told me that I was being dramatic, and that he had only acted out of necessity to protect the family name. He said that Savannah's brokerage was a cornerstone of their legacy, and that he would have done the same for me if I were the one in trouble. I didn't let him finish the sentence. I pulled out the third receipt, a certified registration from the Dallas Medical Center. It was dated the exact same day the waiver was allegedly signed in front of a notary in Houston. I read the details aloud, my voice steady and clinical. On that day, while Julian was claiming I was incapacitated in a psychiatric facility to justify signing my name, I was actually standing on a stage in Dallas leading a seminar for 50 trauma surgeons on emergency airway management. I had the hotel bill, the flight confirmation, and a group photograph with the chief of surgery. I wasn't a ghost in a hospital bed. I was a professional at the top of her field, and I had the photographic evidence to prove that my father was a liar. The room went into absolute physical silence. It was the kind of quiet I have only ever experienced in the moments before a patient's heart stops a heavy, suffocating vacuum, where the truth finally becomes undeniable. Savannah's face didn't just pale, it collapsed into a jagged map of terror. She looked at Julian, her mouth opening and closing like she was gasping for air. My mother Claire began to sob, a quiet, high-pitched sound that she tried to hide behind her silk napkin. The managed perfection of the Sterling estate was disintegrating in real time. Julian's authority, built on decades of oil money and social posturing, was being dismantled by a nurse with a 3-ring binder. I looked at the manila envelope Julian had pushed toward me earlier. I told him that he had spent 30 years telling me I was the dumb one, the slow one, the one who couldn't handle the family business. I asked him how it felt to realize that the dumb daughter was the only one in the room who knew how to balance a ledger. The conflict escalated as I turned my attention to the $450,000. I laid out the wire transfer receipts that showed every cent flowing from my stolen equity into Savannah's personal accounts and her failing brokerage. I pointed to a withdrawal for a luxury vacation in the Maldives and another for the emerald dress she was currently wearing. I told her that she wasn't a rising star in real estate. She was a parasite living on the stolen future of the sister she mocked in her secret group chat. Savannah's emerald dress didn't look glamorous anymore. It looked like a shroud. She screamed at me that I didn't understand the pressure she was under, but her voice broke before she could finish the thought. Julian finally found his voice, but it was a ragged, hollow sound. He told me that he would pay it all back as soon as the energy lease was signed. He pleaded with me to think about the family reputation and how a public scandal would destroy everything his parents had built. He was still trying to negotiate, still trying to use my grandmother Pearl's memory as a bargaining chip. I looked at the man who had disowned me by text and realized that he would never understand that the reputation was already dead. It had died the moment he decided that his daughter's life was less important than a real estate commission. I gestured to my advisor, who had remained as silent as a predator until this moment. He opened his own briefcase and produced a series of formal notices. He told Julian that we had already prepared a civil suit for fiduciary fraud and that a criminal referral for identity theft was sitting on his desk in Austin. The drama in the room reached a fever pitch as Julian realized that he wasn't just losing a land deal, he was looking at the potential end of his freedom. My mother Claire stood up, her face a mask of desperation. She told me that I couldn't do this to my own father, and that blood was supposed to be thicker than water. I told her that Julian had drained all the blood out of this family years ago, and now he was just choking on the water. The conflict suggested a new, even more dangerous layer of the Sterling family's rot. I revealed that I had already spoken to the title company's investigator. Because the 2021 waiver was a forgery, the entire chain of title for the 500-acre tract was invalid. If they had signed that $2.2 million lease on Monday, they would have been committing securities fraud on a massive institutional level. They weren't just facing a family dispute, they were facing a federal investigation. Julian's hands were shaking so badly now that he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. He looked at the manila envelope and then at me. And for the first time in my life, I saw him truly afraid. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at my sister and told her that she was going to sign a document of her own tonight. I told her that if she didn't sign a formal confession of the forgery, I would hand my binder over to the district attorney before the sun came up. Savannah looked at Julian for help, but our father was too busy staring at the ruins of his own legacy to look her in the eye. The golden child was finally alone on her stage. The dinner of lies was over, and the only thing left on the menu was the truth. But as I watched Savannah reach for the pen, I noticed a notification pop up on Julian's phone, which was sitting face up on the table. It was a message from the board of the Petroleum Club, and it suggested that the unmasking of the Sterling family had already moved beyond the walls of this dining room. The hunt was just beginning, and Julian was about to find out that his secret group chat wasn't the only place people were talking. I pointed my finger directly at the $450,000 transfer line on the forensic ledger and looked my sister straight in her terrified eyes. I told the room that Savannah didn't actually close those high-stakes Dallas real estate deals she had been bragging about for the last 40 minutes. I explained that I was the one who funded her lifestyle and her failing brokerage unwittingly through the signature they stole from me while I was busy saving lives in another city. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the floor of the Houston estate might give way under the weight of the truth. Savannah's face, which had been a mask of polished porcelain and arrogance for years, finally collapsed into something raw and unrecognizable. The dismissive smirk was gone, replaced by a jagged look of pure animal panic as she realized that the sister she had mocked as a project was actually the person who had been paying her rent. My father, Julian, tried to bluster his way through the ruins of his dignity. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned the color of the white Wedgwood china, and he shouted that they were going to pay it back. He claimed that it was merely a temporary bridge loan to help Savannah get through a difficult quarter and that they were protecting the family's total interests. He spoke about the sterling name as if it were a shield that could deflect the reality of a bank fraud. But I wasn't listening to his excuses anymore because I had heard them my entire life. Julian has always believed that his intentions mattered more than his actions, and that a sterling could never truly be a criminal if the goal was to keep up appearances. That was when the man sitting beside me stood up. Up until that moment, he had been an invisible shadow at the table, but as he straightened his blazer, the atmosphere in the room shifted from a family dispute to a legal execution. His name is Richard Thorne, and he is the senior partner at the very firm my father uses for his business. I had hired him 3 days ago after Sarah showed me the extent of the damage. Richard didn't use the flowery language of reconciliation. He spoke with the cold, flat tone of a man who spent his life putting people like Julian behind bars. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid it on top of the dessert plates. He informed Julian and Savannah that he had already prepared a formal felony fraud referral for the Harris County District Attorney's Office. The conflict in the room reached a fever pitch as my mother Claire let out a stifled scream and covered her mouth with a silk napkin. Richard explained that the forgery wasn't just a family matter because it involved the interstate transfer of funds and the misrepresentation of a medical status to a federally insured financial institution. He told Julian that by claiming I was in a long-term care facility to gain access to the trust, they had committed multiple counts of identity theft and wire fraud. Savannah started to cry then, but it wasn't the soft, pretty crying of a victim. It was the frantic sobbing of someone who finally saw the prison bars closing in. She looked at Julian and begged him to do something, but my father was staring at Richard with the blank, hollow eyes of a man who realized he had just handed the keys to his empire to the daughter he tried to erase. This moment was the absolute reversal of every dynamic I had grown up with. In the Sterling house, I was the one who was always in the wrong. I was the one who had to apologize for being too quiet or too busy or too different. Savannah was the golden child whose every mistake was scrubbed away by Julian's checkbook. But tonight, the checkbook was empty, and the mistakes were too large to be hidden under a Houston garden party. I realized that my sister wasn't a rising star. She was a hollowed-out shell of a person who had been taught that she didn't have to follow the rules as long as she wore the right labels. She had been living a lie for 3 years, and I was the one who had been forced to pay for the stage. The layers of the betrayal were laid bare on that damask cloth. Richard pointed out that the $450,000 hadn't just gone to business expenses. He showed the receipts for a $20,000 plastic surgery bill for Savannah and a series of high-end furniture purchases for her Dallas penthouse. My sister had been using my grandmother's legacy to buy a version of herself that didn't exist while I was wearing $10 scrubs and working double shifts. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They had sat in that secret group chat mocking my modest apartment and my used car while they were using my stolen money to buy things they didn't even need. Julian tried one last time to use weaponized vulnerability. He leaned across the table and told me that if I moved forward with the charges, I would be the one who killed my mother. He said her heart couldn't take the scandal and that I would be responsible for the total destruction of the Sterling family. It was a classic move from the Julian playbook. If you can't win the argument, you make the other person responsible for the consequences of your own crimes. But I had spent a decade in the trauma bay looking at real heart failure and real suffering. I knew the difference between a medical emergency and a manipulative performance. I told him that the only person who had destroyed this family was the man who decided that his daughter was a resource instead of a human being. The drama suggested a new and even more terrifying conflict for the golden child. Richard revealed that because the forged waiver had been used to secure a business loan for Savannah's brokerage, the bank was now conducting its own internal investigation. The loan was in default because the collateral was fraudulent. This meant that Savannah wasn't just facing a lawsuit from me, she was facing a total collapse of her credit and a permanent ban from the real estate industry. Her entire identity, which was built on being a high-powered mogul, was about to be stripped away in a very public and very humiliating fashion. She wouldn't just be broke, she would be an outcast in the very circles she lived for. I watched Savannah look at her emerald dress, as if it were suddenly made of lead. She realized that she couldn't charm her way out of a forensic audit. My parents had spent 30 years making her feel invincible, and in doing so, they had left her completely defenseless against the truth. I felt a strange sense of pity for her in that moment, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of the anniversary gala, where she had laughed while Julian called me unstable. She had been a willing participant in my erasure, and now she was the one being erased. The hierarchy of the Sterling family had been flipped on its head, and the golden child was finally looking up at the sister she had tried to bury. The ending of this unmasking was a sharp reminder of the American legal reality. Richard told Julian that we had already notified the title company about the fraud. The $2.2 million oil lease was now officially dead. The energy company had pulled the offer and was considering a suit for breach of contract because Julian had misrepresented the status of the land title. My parents were no longer just losing an inheritance, they were losing their primary residence and their total social standing. The Sterling house was no longer a monument, it was a liability. But the most surprising part came when Julian's phone buzzed on the table with a notification from the club. It was an email informing him that his membership was being reviewed due to allegations of financial impropriety. The secret was out, and the Sterling family was about to find out exactly how fast a Texas social circle can turn into a pack of wolves. I stood up and told them that the dinner was over, but the audit was just beginning. The silence in the dining room was no longer the quiet of a family dinner, but the heavy air of a courtroom just before a verdict is read. I didn't look at the steak cooling on my Wedgwood plate or the vintage wine that Julian had poured to celebrate my surrender. Instead, I pulled out my phone and laid it flat on the mahogany surface. I told the table that since we were being a real family again, it was time to share the group chat that I had discovered by accident on an old tablet. I watched my mother Claire freeze with her wine glass halfway to her lips as I opened the messages. This wasn't just a digital conversation, it was the social ledger of my erasure. I began to read the messages from the night of the gala 5 years ago. My father's words appeared on the screen for everyone to see. He had texted my mother and Savannah telling them to make sure they told the board of directors I was on a 5150 psychiatric hold so they could move the Pearl assets without me causing a scene. The reaction was instantaneous. My Aunt Susan and Uncle David, who had been sitting at the far end of the table looking uncomfortable since the advisor sat down, gasped in unison. They were the ones Julian had convinced to sign off on certain trust amendments because they truly believed I was in a facility receiving intensive care. Julian tried to stand up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor like a wounded animal. He shouted that I was taking things out of context and that private family venting wasn't a crime. But I kept scrolling. I read the message Savannah sent 3 weeks later mocking my husband Mark and calling him a public defender who wouldn't know a forged signature if it hit him in the face. The social capital my father had spent 35 years meticulously building through country club handshakes and charitable donations was evaporating in 10 minutes. The conflict escalated as Aunt Susan stood up, her face a mask of profound disgust. She looked at Julian and told him that she had defended him to the entire Houston social registry for years. She said she had told everyone that his daughter was sick and that he was a saint for managing the burden. Now she realized she had been an unwitting accomplice to a felony. She didn't wait for an explanation. She grabbed her purse and walked out of the white-pillared estate without looking back. Uncle David followed her, pausing only to tell Julian that he would be resigning from the bank board by morning. The Sterling name, which had been a gold standard in this city for generations, was suddenly a toxic asset. My parents had gambled their reputation on the idea that I would never speak up, and they had lost everything. The drama suggested a new and even more devastating blow to the family's survival. As the front door slammed shut, signaling the exit of their only social protectors, I turned to the digital trail of the last 3 years. I showed the table the messages where Claire and Savannah coordinated their outfits for the anniversary trip to Hawaii, the one I was never told about. They had spent thousands of dollars on a vacation while texting the group that they hoped I was enjoying my hospital food. The cruelty wasn't just financial, it was recreational. They enjoyed the exclusion. They felt more like a real family when I was the ghost they could haunt. My mother began to wail, then a sound of pure social humiliation that had nothing to do with remorse. She wasn't sorry she had lied. She was terrified that the bridge club would find out. I realized then that the Sterling family didn't have a foundation. They had a stage. And now that the lights were being turned on, they had nowhere to hide. Savannah was still staring at the screen, her eyes red and her hands shaking so hard she dropped her phone into her lap. She had been the one who suggested the 5150 narrative because she knew it was the only way to get the bank to waive my physical presence at the signing. She was the architect of my insanity, and now she was looking at the blueprint of her own destruction. I told her that she shouldn't worry about the brokerage anymore, because nobody in Dallas would touch a listing from a woman whose own family chat was about to become public record. The conflict deepened when Julian turned his rage toward me. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He demanded to know how I dared to humiliate him in his own home after everything he had given me. He was still trying to use the childhood of scraps as a reason for my eternal gratitude. He mentioned the used laptop and the hand-me-down car as if they were philanthropic achievements. I looked at the man who had disowned me by text, and I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for 30 years. I told him that he didn't give me a life. He gave me a role to play, and I was officially resigning. The advisor sitting beside me reached into his briefcase and produced a second folder. This one contained a draft of a press release we had prepared for the Houston Chronicle. The threat of public exposure was the final nail in the coffin. Julian's bluster died out, leaving him looking like a small, tired man in a very expensive suit. He realized that if the story of the 5150 lie went public, he wouldn't just lose his business, he would be a pariah in the only world he valued. The layers of the Sterling family's rot were now fully exposed to the people who mattered most to them, their peers, their partners, and their prey. I told them that the only thing keeping that press release from being sent was the speed at which they agreed to my final terms. I wasn't there to negotiate a settlement. I was there to perform a total liquidation of their power. The surprising ending to this social collapse was the arrival of a notification on Savannah's own phone. It was a message from her largest client in Dallas, a man who had been a guest at the Petroleum Club Gala. Apparently, Aunt Susan had already made a phone call. The news of the Sterling fraud was moving faster than a West Texas wildfire. Savannah's face went a ghostly white as she read the words terminating her contract with immediate effect. The golden child was being stripped of her crown in real time. My parents had spent 5 years trying to make me invisible, but in the end, they were the ones who were disappearing from the world they loved. I stood up and told my advisor it was time to move to the study. I told Julian and Claire that the dinner was over, but the paperwork was just beginning. They had 10 minutes to decide if they wanted to sign the voluntary transfer of the trust, or if they wanted to wait for the police to arrive. I walked out of the dining room, leaving the Wedgwood china and the cold tenderloin behind. I felt the steel under the quiet turning into a fortress. I was no longer the daughter who was always just there. I was the woman who had just audited the Sterling name out of existence. The next conflict wasn't going to be about who belonged at the table. It was going to be about who owned the house. I walked into my father's study, a room that smelled of old money, leather-bound lies, and the expensive scotch Julian used to numb the reality of his failing empire. The mahogany walls seemed to shrink around him as he sat behind his massive desk, his hands trembling so violently he had to tuck them under the blotter. My mother Claire was huddled in the corner chair, her silk dress rumpled, looking like a ghost of the socialite she had been only an hour ago. Savannah stood by the window, staring out at the manicured Houston lawn. She no longer owned her emerald silk dress, now nothing more than a green shroud for her dead reputation. The air was thick with the suffocating silence of a verdict about to be delivered. I didn't sit down. I stood in the center of the room, the coordinator of a trauma unit, ready to perform the final extraction of the Sterling family's power. I looked at Julian and told him that I wasn't there to seek a prison sentence or to watch him exchange his tailored blazer for a jumpsuit. I told him that I was offering him mercy, but not the kind he was used to. I was offering mercy as a total and absolute power move. My father looked up, a spark of his old predatory instinct flickering in his eyes. But it died the moment my advisor, Richard Thorne, laid the final set of documents on the desk. I told them that I would not file the formal criminal report for identity theft, wire fraud, and fiduciary embezzlement if they agreed to my final terms immediately. The choice was simple. They could sign away their pride, or they could spend their golden years in a federal facility. The first term was non-negotiable. Julian and Claire had to sign over their remaining interest in the Houston estate and the family trust to a new entity managed by a board of directors I had already selected. Every cent of the remaining assets would be diverted into a charitable foundation dedicated to pediatric physical therapy, the very field my mother used to mock as blue-collar work. This was my grandmother Pearl's favorite cause, and it was the only way to ensure that the Sterling legacy actually did some good in the world after decades of being used as a personal piggy bank. My parents would be allowed to live in the house, but they would no longer own the ground they walked on. They were becoming tenants in the monument they built to themselves. The conflict in the room shifted from terror to a desperate clawing resistance. Claire began to cry, asking how they could possibly explain to the country club that they had given away their home. She spoke about the Sterling name and the heritage they were supposed to protect. I looked at her and reminded her that the Sterling name died the moment she helped Julian coordinate my medical erasure in a group chat. I told her that she should be grateful I was giving her a roof over her head at all, considering she had spent 5 years hoping I was eating hospital food in a locked ward. The sweetness was gone from my mother's face, replaced by the hollow realization that her social standing was a currency that had just been permanently devalued. Then I turned to Savannah. My sister finally looked at me, her eyes red and jagged with a hatred she could no longer hide. I told her that she had 1 hour to sign a formal, notarized confession of the 2021 forgery. This confession would be sent to the Texas Board of Nursing and my hospital administration to fully clear my professional record of any allegations of mental instability. It would also be sent to the Dallas Real Estate Board. Savannah's career as a mogul was over, but her survival depended on her admitting that she was a thief. She tried to bargain, claiming that such a document would destroy her life forever. I told her that she had already destroyed her own life. I was just making sure she didn't take my nursing license down with her. Julian tried to intervene, his voice a ragged whisper as he asked if there was any other way. He offered to pay me double the amount they had stolen if I would just keep the confession private. He was still trying to buy his way out of a character deficit. I looked at the man who had disowned me by text message and told him that his money was gone. The energy company had pulled the lease, the bank was auditing the trust, and the only thing he had left to trade was his own public resignation. I told him that as part of the mercy deal, he would formally resign from every board, club, and committee he belonged to in Houston. He would cite health reasons, but he would know and I would know that he was being purged. The drama escalated as the weight of the social capital collapse finally hit Julian. He realized that the world he lived for, the handshakes, the toasts, the elite invitations, was now a locked door. He was being forced to tender his resignation from the social registry he had spent 35 years climbing. He was being stripped of his crown by the daughter he called a project. I watched him reach for the gold fountain pen, the one he used to sign the forged waiver, and his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't find the line. Richard Thorne stood over him, a silent reminder that the law doesn't care about family loyalty when a felony has been committed. Savannah finally broke. She realized that Julian couldn't save her anymore. The golden child was alone in the dark, and the only way out was to tell the truth. She grabbed the pen and signed the confession with a jagged, desperate script. As the ink dried, I felt a decade of weight lift off my shoulders. The narrative of my instability was dead. The lie that had kept me small and invisible was being dismantled by the very person who invented it. I took the document from the desk and tucked it into my bag next to my excellence in nursing pin. I was no longer the dumb one or the slow one. I was the one who had just audited the Sterling family out of existence. The conflict suggested a final absolute realignment of the family hierarchy. Julian signed the transfer papers, his face aging 10 years in 10 seconds. He looked at me and asked if I was happy now that I had ruined them. I didn't smile and I didn't gloat. I told him that I hadn't ruined them. I had simply stopped pretending that I didn't see who they really were. I told him that the foundation would begin its work in the morning and that he should expect a call from the new board regarding the maintenance schedule for the house. The patriarch was now a ward of the state he tried to manipulate. As I walked toward the study door, my mother Claire reached for my arm, her voice a fragile plea. She asked if I would still come for Christmas now that everything was settled. I looked at the woman who had helped coordinate my exclusion for 3 years and felt a profound sense of relief that I didn't hate her anymore. I just didn't care. I told her that I would be spending Christmas with my husband Mark and the people who actually showed up at my graduation. I told her that family isn't a blood type. It's a commitment to the truth, and she had forfeited her seat at my table a long time ago. The surprising ending to these final terms was the realization that Julian's business partners had already started distancing themselves. As we walked into the foyer, the phone on the hall table was ringing incessantly. Julian's assistant was leaving a message about a series of emergency meetings and an inquiry from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The audit I started in my Austin living room had triggered a massive institutional collapse that moved far beyond my grandmother's land. I walked out of the white-pillared estate and down the stone steps, the Houston humidity no longer feeling like a weight. I was free. I was seen. And for the first time in 33 years, the Sterling name belonged to me because I was the only one who hadn't tarnished it. The hunt was over, but the story of Caroline Sterling was just beginning. The heavy mahogany doors of the study felt like the entrance to a vault where the Sterling family had kept their secrets locked away for decades. I looked at the gold fountain pen sitting on the desk, the same one my father Julian had used to sign away my humanity 5 years ago. He was watching me with the eyes of a defeated predator, his shoulders slumped and his face a map of ruin. He thought this was the end of the negotiation. He believed that by signing over the Houston estate to a charity and giving me a confession, he had finally settled the debt. But as I reached into the final compartment of my leather bag, I felt the crisp edge of a document that had been waiting for this exact moment. This was the reason I had laughed when the lawyer first sat on my sofa in Austin. This was the final receipt written in the ironclad handwriting of my grandmother Pearl. I laid the paper on the desk, and the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop. It wasn't a new trust agreement or a plea for mercy. It was a document titled Conditional Codicil to the Pearl Sterling Estate. My father's hand froze halfway to his glass of scotch as he recognized his mother's signature. Pearl was a woman who understood the specific type of greed that ran in the Sterling blood. She had spent 70 years watching Julian prioritize image over integrity, and she had built a trap that only he could trigger. I told the room that Pearl didn't just leave me a 500-acre tract of land in the Permian Basin. She left me the entire kingdom, but only if Julian proved himself to be the man she feared he was. I read the central clause aloud, my voice echoing off the leather-bound books that Julian had used to decorate his life. The codicil stated that if Julian or Claire Sterling ever attempted to forge Caroline's name, misrepresent her medical status to a court of law, or exclude her from a family inheritance through fraudulent means, the entirety of the Julian and Claire family trust would immediately dissolve. Under the terms of the ethical heir provision, the total assets including the Houston estate, the remaining oil portfolios, and even Julian's private retirement funds would legally revert to me as the sole surviving ethical beneficiary. By forging my name on that waiver 2 years ago, Julian hadn't just stolen $450,000. He had accidentally handed me the keys to his entire existence. The conflict in the room shifted from defeat to a total paralyzing shock. My mother Claire gasped, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes darting around the room as if the walls were already closing in. She realized in that heartbeat that she didn't just lose her standing at the country club. She had lost her house, her car, and her very security to the daughter she had helped erase. Savannah let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, her emerald dress rustling as she sank into a chair. The golden child was now a guest in a house owned by the sister she called a project. The hierarchy of 30 years was not just flipped, it was incinerated. Julian tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for a legal loophole that didn't exist. He stammered about the unfairness of it and how a mother could never do that to her own son. But he knew Pearl. He knew she was a woman of absolute justice, who believed that a legacy was earned, not just inherited. Richard Thorne, the senior partner who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward to confirm the validity of the document. He told Julian that the title search for the energy company had already triggered the automatic transfer. The paperwork was already filed in Harris County. I wasn't just the owner of a piece of West Texas dirt. I was the landlord of the Sterling estate. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair behind the desk, the seat of power that Julian had guarded like a fortress my entire life. I looked at my parents, who were now standing in a room that legally belonged to me. The irony was a physical weight. For 5 years they had sent me messages about a real family while excluding me from their reality. They had used my name as a tool and my reputation as a weapon. Now the narrative was finally in my hands. I told them that I was going to keep the Houston house for them. I wasn't going to put them on the street, because unlike them, I understood the true meaning of family loyalty. But I told them that the rent would be exactly $1 a month, due on the first of the month, personally delivered to my office in Austin. The drama reached its final crescendo when I looked at Savannah. I told her that she would be moving out of the Dallas penthouse by the end of the week because the trust was no longer subsidizing her performance of success. She would have to find a real job and a real life away from the stolen equity of a sister she never bothered to know. Savannah's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She realized that the stage was gone and the audience had moved on. She was no longer the rising star. She was a woman who would have to learn the value of a dollar she didn't steal. I looked at my father, whose eyes were filled with a mixture of shame and a newfound terrifying respect. He realized that the daughter he called unstable was the only one with the strategic vision to see 3 moves ahead. I told him that for the first time in 33 years, I would be the one managing the narrative. I would be the one deciding who was invited to dinner and who was featured in the family legacy. The Sterling name was no longer a symbol of oil and ego. It was a foundation for the children I worked with in the trauma bay. I was taking the money that was meant for designer dresses and country club dues, and I was putting it into the hands of people who actually knew how to fight for their lives. The surprising payoff of this legacy was the feeling of absolute peace that settled over me. I didn't feel the need to scream or to exact revenge through cruelty. The truth was enough. I had the receipts, I had the land, and I had the absolute proof that my grandmother Pearl had loved me enough to wait for me to find my strength. I stood up and handed the gold pen back to Julian. I told him he should keep it as a reminder that a signature is only as good as the character of the person holding the pen. I walked out of the study through the grand foyer and down the stone steps toward my car. As I drove away from the white pillars and the managed perfection of my childhood, I saw my mother standing at the window watching me leave. She looked small and fragile, a woman who had spent her life building a house on sand and was now surprised that the tide had come in. I felt a momentary sting of sadness for her, but it was quickly replaced by the thought of Mark waiting for me in Austin. I was going home to a life that was honest, a life that was earned, and a life that was entirely mine. The final outcome was the total restoration of the ethical order. The Sterling family empire had collapsed, but in its place, something real was growing. I had cleared my name, secured my future, and reclaimed the dignity they tried to steal. I am Caroline Sterling. I am a trauma nurse, a wife, and the sole owner of a legacy that finally has a soul. The hunt was over, and as I hit the highway toward Austin, I realized that the best part of owning the empire was knowing I didn't need it to be happy. I had already built my own world, and this time the narrative was written in my own hand. If you've ever been the one left out of the photo, or the one told you weren't enough, remember this: the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you the keys to the house. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm Caroline, and I finally learned that the most powerful thing you can ever sign is your own path forward. As I drove away from the Sterling estate, the Houston skyline shimmering in my rearview mirror, I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. Instead, I felt a profound, quiet weightlessness. For 33 years, I had carried the heavy burden of being the unstable daughter, the project, the shadow. Now that weight was gone, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of my own worth. I looked at the folder on my passenger seat, containing Savannah's confession and the trust documents. They weren't just legal wins, they were my grandmother Pearl's final way of telling me that she saw the steel in me all along. The Sterling house would remain standing, and Julian and Claire would still sleep in their silk sheets. But the foundation had shifted forever. They were no longer the gatekeepers of my reality. As the sun set over the Texas plains, I realized that the greatest inheritance I ever received wasn't the land or the trust. It was the courage to stop waiting for them to love me and start loving the woman I had worked so hard to become. I was returning to Austin, to a man who saw me a career that fulfilled me and a name that finally meant integrity. Reflecting on this journey, there are 5 lessons I hope you take away from my story. Documentation is your shield. Whether it is a medical record, a bank statement, or a secret diary, the truth is only as strong as your ability to prove it. Keep your receipts. Silence is not weakness. My family mistook my quiet nature for fragility. In reality, silence is where you observe the patterns, gather the data, and prepare your move. Blood is not a blank check. Family loyalty should be earned through mutual respect, not extracted through guilt. You do not owe your life to people who only view you as a resource. Professionalism is power. My career as a nurse gave me the clinical discipline to audit my family's lies without emotion. Build a world outside your family so you have somewhere to stand when theirs collapses. The narrative belongs to you. People will try to label you to suit their needs. Unstable, selfish, or difficult are often just words used to control you. You are the only one who gets to hold the pen. As I crossed the city limits, I realized that Pearl didn't just leave me an empire. She left me a choice. I chose to be the landlord of my own life. I chose to manage the narrative. And I chose to never let anyone make me invisible ever again. Thank you for walking this long, difficult road with me. If this story touched your heart, or reminded you of your own strength, please let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories for more journeys of vindication and truth. No matter where you are or what time it is, remember that you are the sole ethical heir to your own future. Don't let anyone forge your signature on a life you didn't choose. I'm Caroline, and I'll see you in the next story.